Welcome to Washington State Legends of Soccer and our series, Why History Matters. I'm Frank MacDonald. Today, our guest is Pablo Maurer. Pablo is a staff writer for The Athletic who covers soccer with a particular focus on the history and culture of the game. Welcome, Pablo.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
As I was saying before we started the recording, it was one of your former colleagues, Matt Pence, who we know here in Seattle, who told me long ago we definitely needed to have a conversation with you. And clearly you have written or collaborated on several terrific stories of America's soccer roots. And most recently, that comes to mind is the Florence Murphy and the St. Louis Women's League back in the, gosh, almost 100 years ago, it seems like. And then the Wee Willie McLean, man, that mystery was fun. So thank you. Thank you for all the diligence and your craft of engrossing storytelling. Some of these subjects would seem rather random, so I'm curious, where do you go looking for soccer history, or does it find you?
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought, American soccer history is sort of a pretty fertile ground for story ideas. I mean, if you look at other major sports, baseball, particularly baseball, basketball, American football, it's sort of well-worn territory. There aren't a lot of really oddball, off the wall sort of stories left, I think, to pick from those sports. But soccer's different. I mean, I think especially the sort of middle distance of the 70s, 80s, 90s, not a lot of people have sort of started writing about the history of the game in that era.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think at first it was as far as where I find the stories, I mean, it would just be me falling down to rabbit holes and finding some random interesting factoid and then just almost selfishly sort of researching that, because I was interested in it, and then being like, well, I could turn this into a story. I think as time went on and maybe as I gained a bit of a following, I still do that a lot, but I also probably, once a week will get a Twitter DM or something from somebody that says, hey, have you heard about this? Because at this point I might have a reputation for writing about all this stupid stuff. So some of it's crowdsourced these days, but most of it is still just me poking around. I think the Wee Willie one is really interesting, because to give your viewers, your listeners, some background. I mean, I did a story on with Matt Pence, who you mentioned, on a member of the 1934 U.S. World Cup team who just vanished off the face of the earth 3 years later in 1937 and was literally never heard from again. And that came about just by me telling Pence, who I enjoy him tremendously as a person and as a writer, and I always enjoy collaborating with him. I told him, look, let's do something on sort of like more ancient U.S. soccer history. Like, let's look at the 30 World Cup. That team has sort of already been done because it was the first one. The 1950 World Cup guys also sort of well-worn because obviously their memorable victory over England, but the 34 World Cup team, to me, looking at it, it seemed almost forgotten. Mm-hmm. So we went, it was like 1 a.m, just sort of we're on Slack chatting, and we go to the 34 World Cup roster and click on Wee Willie McLean's name, and then you see in his Wikipedia, it just says that he disappeared. So at that point, it's like, obviously we're going to write this, we didn't expect to find out what happened to him. And it took 2 years, we did, but that would be an example of just sort of falling down the rabbit hole,
What do you find that certain areas of the country are more forthcoming about their history? I mean, I know there are, but and does anything ever come to mind when it shifts out west, or are we the exception?
No, I mean, I think I think you have probably 3 or 4 really fertile areas for soccer history, the Pacific Northwest being one of them, obviously, particularly when it comes to the NASL era in the 60s and 70s. You have the Timbers, the Sounders, obviously, both teams that sort of through fits and starts remained operational, for
Yeah.
decades afterwards. But so if there's a lot to dig into, and a lot that's been preserved about the history of the game in your neck of the woods, also, in New Jersey or in St. Louis, or
Mhm.
these are sort of the traditional kind of meccas of American soccer, right? Or like the industrial Northeast,
Yeah.
same type of thing, parts of Pennsylvania. But then for sure they're just sort of kind of barren wastelands. I mean, the Southeast is one that comes to mind. I remember finding out recently that Bobby Moore had, he was the goalie for an ASL team in North Carolina. I think the early '80s, mid '80s, something like that, or not Bobby Moore. It was
Bobby Clark.
Bobby. Yes, exactly. I mean, there's just stuff like that. I mean, I think when you start getting to the Southeast, or Florida, or even the Midwest, it gets a little bit more kind of esoteric and undefined and a little more mysterious.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I think I read somewhere when I was researching college history that like Florida State was the first varsity collegiate program, or maybe it's just a recognized program, which was shocking to me that would have been there. I would have thought, oh, Rutgers or Ivy
St.
League, or
University, yeah, something like that. Yeah,
yeah.
anything. Yeah.
So um, what have the current powers that be, or federations or leagues or clubs, have they done enough, or what do you see them doing to protect or emphasize American soccer history, or are they still just trying to do the day to day?
Well, if we start with MLS, we just start at the top. I mean, I think I think the league has, like, maybe in more recent years, embraced some of its earliest history, but also has been equally interested in erasing its own history, sort of via all the rebrands and new logos and FCs and this and the other thing. It seems like, it's always been kind of ironic to me, because I think Major League Soccer, what it really strives to be, is this sort of authentic, and I put that in air quotes because I think what they're striving for is this sort of like British experience or Euro experience.
Yeah.
Strive for that, but in the process, they erase the only actual historical cachet or history they have. Their original identities. The 35-yard shootout, all the weird, wonderful things about the early days of the year, or early days of the league. So it's sort of a mixed bag. Individual clubs in MLS, to varying degrees, do an okay job. Again, if you look at Seattle or Portland, they do a pretty good job. I think it's because their fans are sort of into that and invested in the history of the team.
Mhm.
There are other teams, though, like DC United, whom I cover on the day to day. I've done a pretty horrendous job of it. I mean, even if you walk around their stadium, and that's a team that has a deep tradition in MLS. They were MLS's first dynasty, all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
There's not, you would barely even know DC United plays there. They should sort of have, title banners and, things that celebrate their history, but there's none of it. So,
Huh.
you know, and US soccer has done an okay job. I will say, like the National Soccer Hall of Fame obviously is a tremendous resource, and I feel thankful that it exists. It's not an ideal location. It's not an ideal collection. But even they could do much better. I mean, the national, their archives in North Carolina, where I've gone many times to research and stuff, is just sort of a hodgepodge of stuff in cardboard boxes with no real
No
rhyme or
map.
reason. I mean, there's sort of lots of physical media, photos, negatives, all sort of stuff that all needs to be realistically digitized and preserved. And it's like, that is a massive undertaking that they're going to have to deal with at some point. So yeah,
Huh.
people do it better than others, is what I would say.
Okay. Do if there was a now defunct club, now I don't know if you're lifelong DC, but if there was a now defunct club in American soccer history that you wish had survived or been successfully revived, I don't know, would it be the Dips? Would it be or who would you want to pull back into the active queue?
Interesting. That's a really interesting question. I mean, probably the Cosmos, honestly, just because of what they stood for. And I do think there's elements of that club story. They're almost like mythical now, right? I mean, like you know, I think things have gotten exaggerated over the years, but undoubtedly to people of a certain age, they were soccer's whole kind of identity in this country, and they were ambitious and they brought over the best players and they, obviously it's not a sustainable thing, but just that brand identity alone, I was a little disappointed when the club reformed. They initially tried to get an MLS. There's a whole, backstory behind that. I should probably write. It didn't work out, and I think that's a real shame. You know what I mean? I think that brand still has a lot of cachet, and it would have been pretty killer. The Dips has another probably good one, just because I've been in DC for 16 years. I've, in addition to what I do for the Athletic and just sort of what I actually write, I mean, I have a million projects that I just do, like I said, selfishly. And one of them was years ago, I just set out with every Dips roster from 74 to 80, and just basically tracked down every single player, and just started doing interviews, so at this point of, tens of thousands of words of interviews from
kind of a boys of summer kind of a deal.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was important to preserve, because I think, Frank, like what I just said about how, I think the NASL is stuck in this, like I said, the kind of middle distance where it's like, it's not new enough to be relevant and it's not old enough to be actively thought of as like this essential history that's, like worth preserving. But the messed up thing is that the guys who played in the league are all dying, one by one. I mean, I remember I did a piece on Team America in 2016, and I actually recently revisited that subject matter for a piece coming out in a couple of weeks. And in the time between then and now, the owner of the team who I'd spoken with, he passed away, and then two players in the team passed away. So it's like, with the Dips project, for me, it was just more like, well, let's get all these guys coming on the record, because who knows if anybody else might think to do it,
Exactly. Yeah. No, we've hit the same challenges here. We've interviewed a number of people in our community, and before we've been able to post produce the interview, they passed away. I mean, it is, but we're glad we've got the interviews.
I mean, you mentioned Matt Knight, Mike Craigley piece. I've done so much stuff on Matt that I think I just gave him credit for something he didn't write. My Craigley piece, I mean, Florence Murphy, who I spoke with, who was at the time one of two remaining players, passed away before the piece came out, so it just goes to show you,
Right. So without giving away, you just kind of touched upon something you're working on. What's a personal favorite story from U.S. soccer history that you believe should get more credit or more play?
I'm relieved to see a lot of work being done around like the 1990 World Cup guys, the guys who played in the mid 80s. I really think there's probably something really interesting to be written about the USISL and the ASL of the 80s and early 90s, because I think if you really look at it, the darkest kind of period in US soccer history was that sort of, after, between the folding of the NASL and the birth of MLS, those interceding years, obviously without, not taking into account the 94 World Cup, which was formative, there's just like nothing out there on them. You know what I mean? And you have, it's just like the USISL, you have these 4 or 5 sort of interregional leagues with dozens of teams, and, they had a women's league and all this other stuff. And it's just like that legitimately kept the game alive in the United States in those years, so I frequently thought about writing, about, I mean, I'm sure that's a fertile ground to just sort of dig into. And I have written a little bit about it. I wrote about the rules experimentation in that league. I mean, they they had, shorter halves and something still, every time I think about it, makes me laugh, which is something called a stampede kick, which was a a breakaway penalty kick they tried where the penalty kick taker would run up to the ball 40 yards from goal. Every other player on the field except the goalies would line up 10 yards behind them. And so the player would run with the ball, touch it, and then he'd have, 18, 19 guys chasing him from behind. I talked to Tony Miola, who's the goalie who faced one of these, and he said he just ran over. You could feel the field like rumbling, and he ran over to his coach, Alfonso Mandelo, and just told him, like, somebody's gonna die. Like, we can't do this, but I bet there's probably lots of other good USISL stories that I need to poke around and dig into.
That sounds well. We had some teams in some of those leagues, and if not players. So yeah, it was even the indoor leagues that were up. Like I know guys that played in Tupelo and some other towns I'd never heard of before that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I want to know as we wrap this up, and thank you so much, but is there a homework assignment if you say you get these messages on Twitter or maybe on message boards, but is there a homework assignment you want to give all of us and our audience to work on to lift up some stories or go find stories?
Yeah, I imagine your audience is obviously pretty well versed and well educated. I'd probably speak more to the average MLS fan and just remind them that soccer in this country existed for a century or more before that league was founded, and that league was founded on the success, well, really both the success and failure of a bunch of other leagues. And again, like, not just the NASL. The NASL is maybe the only other one that's remembered, obviously, because it became such a circus, and it was a thing where they kind of almost made it. But just to poke around, it cracks me up, man, because MLS recently has started. Last year, they started posting clips on their social media of players taking 35-yard penalty shots, goalie wars, stuff like that. And I had to laugh because you go into the comments and it's like people literally saying, like, "Oh my God, what was this?" I mean, like, the people who did not even realize that even happened, even in the league they follow nowadays, let alone that idea came from an entirely different league, decades earlier. I think maybe another thing too, and this is the subject of a piece I'm writing, is I would tell people to recognize America's place in innovating the game. I think there's an attitude that any soccer idea that comes out of the United States is dead on arrival, and it's just not true. I mean, I read my own outlet, The Athletic. We obviously have a bunch of writers in the UK. I can't remember which one wrote a brilliant article on the back pass rule, which started after the '90 World Cup, obviously, which was one of the worst ever played. I think obviously the top flight in England sort of instituted, and it's been revolutionary. Except it didn't start there; it started in the NASL. They had that rule for 2 years in the NASL. They had a lot of rules that have since sort of gone on to be adopted by European soccer, but aren't even associated with America because this is a footballing backwater.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I would encourage people to recognize this country's place in the history of the game, and it's a valuable place. Whether some Euro snob would want to admit that or not. So yeah, that'd be my message. I don't know how useful that is to your audience, but that's probably what I would tell soccer consumers at large in the United States.
Well, that is good advice, and there's still people that will remember that and could give a testimony to why it didn't catch on or why it did. But yeah, Pablo, thanks so much for sharing your stories and your excellent coverage on The Athletic. You can follow Pablo on Twitter at MLSist. Thanks to our producer, Leanne Johnson, and thanks to all of you for watching Why History Matters, our series here on Washington State Legends of Soccer. You can find out more about our organization at wasoccerlegends.org. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.